Good to be talking to you again today. Welcome to Whiteboarding 111. We're going into the professional whiteboarding toolbox. And today I'm going to be talking about feedback walks. I've spent a lot of time talking about the whiteboarding cycle. The whiteboarding cycle starts with an element and an interaction. Students respond or answer. And then there's feedback and revision. And the feedback walks tend to fit into that answer-response portion. And so while students are answering or responding on their whiteboards, the teacher has a really important role to play. And that brings me to a series I'm going to talk about in the next couple of weeks that I'm titling Ways Not to Use Whiteboards. And this is the first way that I see more often than any other way of using whiteboards that doesn't necessarily utilize the power of 3 higher. You know, the high visibility, high information, high frequency with immediate feedback and revision. And that's really what we're looking for when we utilize these tools. So what the teacher will do is they will start with an element and interaction. So for example, the element would be a math question and the interaction would be something simple like, hey, solve this question on your whiteboard. And then what they do is they wait. They wait at the front of the room, or they have something they're doing at the front of the room preparing for the next part of the lesson, or I've seen a lot of times teachers simply pausing, taking a bit of a breather, and just waiting there. And then after a certain amount of time, they might give students a countdown, okay, you should be done in 20 seconds. Or they'll say something like, okay, raise your hand if you have questions, and one student raises their hand, and that initiates the feedback, and they go over and help that one student. Or they'll pass out papers, or they'll go over to their desk and take attendance. I mean, there's a lot of things that teachers will do while students are answering on their whiteboard. And then what they'll do next is they'll say, okay, everyone, hold up your board so I can see it. So then the students hold up their board, the teacher's at the front of the room, the teacher sees what all the students have done on their boards. And they have about 5-10 seconds before it gets really awkward, and they say, okay, everyone, great job, now put your boards down. What a complete waste of an opportunity. There's no feedback, there's no revision. But this cycle happens in classrooms all the time. Teacher gives an element to interaction, teacher kind of hangs out, right, doesn't utilize that time effectively, says hold up your boards. And so it's all about, you must prove to me that you've done what I've asked. It's more of a compliance piece than it is a learning piece. There is absolutely no reason for students to hold the board up so just the teacher can see it. Maybe if you're taking some data at the end of class, you would have your cell phone or a camera and you take pictures of it. Okay guys, boards down. But in that case, you would do a blind show. Close your eyes, hold your boards up as quick as possible. The teacher takes notes or takes pictures, and that's over. But this cycle of answer the question, hold the board up, I look at it, answer the question, hold the board up, I look at it, that is not the whiteboard cycle, and it's a really ineffective way to use whiteboarding. If I were to give it a title, I'd probably call it mechanical whiteboarding. You're going through the mechanics of whiteboarding. Answer this question, hold it up. Answer this question, hold it up. And so you're mechanically doing what you think you should be doing with whiteboards, but it's not as effective as it could be. Like really thinking about each little piece and component and how it works. So that being said, what should the teacher be doing while students are responding and answering? And so here you see we have our whiteboard feedback walks. And it's really important that you very carefully define in your head exactly what type of walk you're going to be doing. If you just go around the classroom haphazardly, choosing what to do throughout, there's not going to be a real focus, and there's not going to be a real intentionality to what you're doing. It's got to be purpose-driven. So the first feedback walk I'm going to talk about briefly is a heads-down help. So students are answering on a board, you have in your mind, okay, this is a heads-down help, so then you start going around the classroom. Now, if you've organized teams well, you know which students will most likely struggle, and so you go over to those students and you look to see where they're struggling. You don't wait till they're done with their answer. You watch what they're doing, and if they get started and you see some mistakes or you see some misconceptions, you get your head down there. You lean down next to them and you try to tutor them and try to help them. I'm a big fan of Socratic tutoring. I'll ask them questions. So what did you do here? Hey, do you remember how we did this? Now, if it's taking a little bit too long, because I want to make sure I get around to see what students have written, I might, on the spot, create a whiteboard tutor. So a student near that team that can help that student, and I'll have them take over for me. And those students have been trained as whiteboard tutors. And that's another professional tool I'll talk about in a later session. Okay, so you get up, you walk, you find the next student that has an error, you lean down next to them, you help them out. You give that immediate feedback so that student can change their answer on the spot rather than waiting at the front of the room. Heads down help is very intentional to get out there and give that feedback right away to students that need it. But don't forget, while you're giving heads down help, you need to make your way through the classroom and ensure that you've seen what all students have written. And to give yourself time for that, I always just added them on as if you finish early, do this. So an extra task that students can do on their whiteboard. So that's a heads down help. Very intentionally walking around, seeing where there's issues and getting down next to individual students and helping them out. One little addition to this, if you see an entire team struggling, you could get down next to the team and help them out, or pairs. When you get to things like half the classroom and that many, you're talking more about the next type of walk, and the next type of walk is a trends walk. So this type of walk is a little bit faster. You move around the room looking for all student trends. And if you see a trend on one side of the room, you can address it with students out loud if you'd like. Okay, I'm worried about this, think about this. Or you can address the whole class. Everyone, here's what I'm seeing. So I want you to think about this that I talked about. You're giving general whole class feedback right away to help. And that's a trends walk. Now, you don't have to shout it out. You'll notice I'm adding teacher shout-outs in there. When you walk around, you could look for those trends and address it whole class after students have responded in your feedback revision cycle. And so you might mix up your whiteboard cycle partway through, add a different feedback and revision response because of what you see in your trends walk. So trends walks are extremely important, especially early on when there's a lot of your students that have the potential to be confused. Later on, when students have practiced a skill, you're going to go more towards your heads down help because there'll be individual struggling students, not a lot of the class. But this is a great sort of walk when you're thinking to yourself, okay, I'm looking for whole class trends and misunderstandings, misconceptions, and I'm going to make sure I do something to address those, either by teacher shout-outs out loud or by waiting to give whole class feedback and revision. One way to give immediate feedback to students is a selective start walk. So on the selective start walk, you're going to utilize a teacher board, and on your teacher board, you start your answer. Once you have an answer that's started, you hold it to yourself and you walk around. Now, like all walks, you're going to look at what students are writing. You're going to get that visibility piece down and think about what they're writing. But if you see students that are struggling, or you know there's specific students that tend to always struggle, you selectively show them your board to help them get started. Right? And then you point to it and say, hey, this is how I got started, giving them some hints, and that will help those students get started. So the selective start walk is very intentional to help students get started on what they need to do. This next type of walk, it's very simple. It's a heads up help, and it's a very intentional look for management. So if students have an interaction that they're great with, for example, illustrated boarding or peer listening, and you want to make sure that they are behaving in the appropriate way, you would walk around and look for misbehaviors. You're not necessarily going to be addressing things you see on boards. You kind of keep your head up. You don't look at what students are writing as much. You're still going to glance on it. You want to keep the visibility up, but when you choose to do a heads up walk, it's one of those things where you're worried about student behavior. Sadly, teachers tend to do this all the time. They only keep their head up, they're only looking for student behavior, and what you'll hear them say is, hey, why isn't your marker writing? Why aren't you writing? Versus look at their board. Think about why they're not writing. There's probably a misunderstanding there. They're probably confused. Maybe they'll need a selective start or some heads down help. We often see misbehavior as intentional. When if a student's not writing something on a board, 9 times out of 10, they just don't even know how to get started, or they're very confused. And last but not least, because it's my favorite walk, I have a positivity walk. Oftentimes, when we're looking around, we're looking at what students are writing, we tend to get very judgmental in our heads, and we start becoming critical of what students are writing. When you keep it in your mind, I'm only doing a positivity walk, I'm only looking for positive things that I can give specific praise towards, then you can start to promote that positive atmosphere in your classroom. And there's a couple ways to do this. You could loudly say the praise to students. I prefer quiet praise, that's individual praise, because then that's not really, it doesn't feel like you're trying to manipulate students. When you get down next to them on their level and you whisper some praise, hey, here's what I really like, you're not saying it to influence the rest of your class, you're legitimately saying it for the sake of that student. And that's the praise, I think, that can be life-changing and can change the atmosphere of your classroom. That being said, you could also use a positivity walk to promote good ideas. Instead, you're shouting out, here's the great things that people are putting on their boards. So it's kind of the other side of the coin in terms of a whole class trends walk is the positivity walk. Taking what students are doing well and trying to spread it around the classroom. So those are some very simple tools, but that's something to really consider and think about. While students are answering and responding, on their own, that 100% of kids, closed board, writing things down, don't stay at the front of the classroom. That is a perfect opportunity for you to get out there and use those walks in order to get students learning and where you need them to be. The idea is that the teacher in some way is involved out there with the whiteboard that's going on. The teacher never sits back passively and waits. We try to prevent ourselves from getting into that mechanical whiteboarding where we're just doing it for the sake of doing it and not being purposeful about every moment in the classroom. So I think a great way to learn about feedback walks is to look at how changing the walk affects a single cycle. And so I'm showing a high school chemistry example. And I want to start with what mechanical whiteboarding would look like. And so here we have an incomplete whiteboard cycle. And the element is an animation. As you can see, it shows sodium and fluorine coming together to create ions. And the task that students are going to complete is they're going to describe what is happening in the animation using Lewis dot structures and a step-by-step description. So it's kind of a lengthy interaction. Students should have been exposed to this before. And so you'll notice mechanical whiteboarding does start with an element interaction, but it's the answer response that is flawed. So while students are answering that, the teacher stays at the front of the classroom, behind their lab station. They might be at their computer doing some work, and they're often found at the front of the room. So students have some time, they whiteboard, and then the teacher goes to the front of the room and says, okay everyone, hold up your board. They all hold up their board, they show the teacher looks at it, says, okay, that was great, let's try another one. And there might be students that missed it, that misunderstood, that could have gotten more with some feedback. There's no revision there. That teacher is just walking students mechanically through practicing whiteboard problems. It's a flawed cycle, and it doesn't promote learning the way immediate feedback and revision do with the 3 higher philosophy. So you see, when we add the feedback and revision on, we make it a lot more powerful. In this particular case, after students have answered, they're going to do a whiteboard walk. So students, you have 30 seconds, you're going to stand up, you're going to walk around, look at other students' boards, and you're going to come back and you're going to add more or change your answer based on what you saw. So they're walking around, getting that peer feedback, seeing what peers have written, and they're going to go back and they're going to add to their board or change their answer. Now this is a harder interaction, so I'm going to add a second feedback step just to show that we can kind of string those together. And the second feedback step will be consensus boarding in their team of 4. And a consensus board simply means students will talk to each other and make sure that their boards reflect what the other students have on their boards as well. And the idea is students should agree on exactly what should be in their answer so that they're getting that peer feedback in those groups. And then the revision is exactly the same as the whiteboard walk. They'll change their answer or add to their board based on what their peers have put down. So now while students are answering and responding, that's when the feedback walks come in. And I want to show you what happens as we change that answer response feedback walk. So let's say we decided to do a heads down help. So the students get started with their interaction, the teacher starts walking around, and they see Andrea. And Andrea's really struggling with her answer. She started by writing the word ionic because she recognizes this, that we learned it, but she doesn't necessarily know what ionic means, and she doesn't even know what Na or F mean because she's mixed up the elements. So we see she's confused, we get down right next to her and say, hey Andrea, take a look at Na, and let's look at your periodic table of elements. All right? What atom is that? And then we do the same thing for fluorine. And then we say, hey, you got your notes here that we took. I want you to look at what we did for sodium chloride compared to sodium fluoride. I'm going to walk away and give more feedback. I'll be back in 2 minutes, and I want you to see if you can take that next step forward. Notice I'm not giving her answers. I'm showing her the resources, what she needs. I'm helping her a little bit get started. I've given that heads down help. Now I'm going to go and try to give more heads down help. That cycle of feedback, not waiting till she's done answering in order to help her. And that's a heads down help. So now I'm doing a classroom trends walk. I walk around and here's what I see. I see a lot of students putting down covalent bonds. Covalent bonds are forming. And they're doing that because we learned about ionic bonding first, then we learned about covalent bonding. So that's foremost inside their head. And so I'm thinking to myself, okay, this is a trend. My students have confused the 2 types of bond. And so I'm going to do a teacher shout out and go, okay everyone, look very carefully at your notes we took. You have ionic bond and covalent bond. Look back and decide which one it is. Notice I'm still not giving answers, but I'm telling my students there's a trend here, and then I continue to walk around. And I see another trend. I see that people aren't putting their Lewis dot structures on correctly. And so I go up to the board and I write a Lewis dot structure unrelated to the task they're doing, a different one, and say, hey everyone, don't forget this is a Lewis dot structure. So now I've given a whole class trend and feedback with a teacher shout out. Now let's say I wanted to do this a little bit differently. I didn't want a shout out. So the two things I saw is they're confusing covalent bonding with ionic bonding, and I saw that they're not drawing correct Lewis dot structures. So after the class is done responding, I'll stop, and now I'm changing my feedback up just a little bit. I'm going to pause my students, I'm going to show them my teacher board, give them that feedback, then I'm going to allow them to continue responding and change their answer. Okay, so I've decided to take that different route using a teacher board to give feedback. It wasn't in my planning, I didn't really think that I needed to do that, but I added it in there because of that class trend. I could do a selective start walk. So I start on my board by drawing a partial Lewis dot structure, and then I bring that around the classroom. So I'm worried students have forgotten what Lewis dot structures are all about, and so I'm walking around with my board, and there's a team that looks confused, so I'm going to show that team how to get started. I'll show them my board. Say, hey guys, don't forget these are Lewis dot structures. Okay, then I'll walk around. Anyone else that's confused, I'll show them my board. Hey, don't forget that's Lewis dot structures. So that's that selective start walk. Now, I could select the entire class to show as I walk around. Whoa, everybody's confused, so I'm just going to hold it out and show everyone my answer and walk around and point and say, don't forget Lewis dot structures. Okay, so then that kind of becomes more teacher board feedback, less selective, but the selective start allows me to do that. The heads up help on this one, I mean, this is a pretty complicated thing for students to do in chemistry, so I'm not sure if I really want to walk around looking for management and seeing who's writing and who's not writing, because here's the deal. If a student isn't writing to answer this question, it's probably not because they're misbehaving. It's not that they know it and they're refusing to do it, it's that they're probably very confused. So a selective start walk or a heads down help might be better on this one than a heads up help. This is not a simple task that most students could do and they're refusing to do. It's a little different. However, if you're worried about the behavior of your students, I suppose you could do a heads up help and walk around and go, hey, you should be writing. But you're really, in this case, kind of confusing confusion with misbehavior. Finally, a positivity walk. You could do that one instead, walking around and pointing out, hey, wow, I love this Lewis dot structure you have here. You've got the words and you've got the dots around just like we practiced. And I shout that out loud. So now students hear that positivity, and that's feedback for them as well to be able to get started on their Lewis dot structure. Or I keep walking around and I see that Andrea has really gotten a good handle on answering the question, so I'll go right next to her and say, Andrea, this is really hard stuff, and I love what you're doing here. You've got your Lewis dot structure. I mean, that's college level what you're doing right there. Great job, keep it up. So now I've given some positive private feedback to Andrea and made her feel good about the things that she's doing. Notice, as privately as possible. I don't want to punish students with praise by having them listen to me say, oh, look how wonderful Andrea is, and then they all look at me like, well, hey, what about me? What about me? And also that kind of makes things socially awkward for Andrea, depending on the atmosphere of my classroom. So positivity walks can give that positive feedback to your kids, but also allow for you to create a positive feel with students in the classroom. All right, so you can definitely see how changing the feedback walk in a very intentional way changes what's happening within this whiteboard cycle for science. All right, great. Next week, I'm going to talk about the 3 main ways that we get feedback in the feedback revision cycle. And those 3 tools are the whiteboard look, the whiteboard pass, and the whiteboard walk. Thanks for your time today. Please feel free to post some feedback, or if you have any questions, please respond below. And I'm looking forward to talking to you again. Have a great week in the classroom, and I will talk to you soon.
One of these days, these boots are gonna walk all over you.